So we have a webinar starting at 4. I think people might be logging in a couple minutes, but the general idea is that we have Michael Scott coming from Southbury University. He's in Maryland presenting right now, so we're going to, hear the broadcast. We're going to see his slides through the webinar system here. Is this the webinar system or is it slides? Awesome. So we got full screen. And then we're going to switch and have Bill Spiatek present to us. So that's going to be great. So I think we've been testing the system. We're good here, but the idea that these are sort of short 15 to 20-minute presentations. We're going to have a couple questions from Michael, but then I maybe want to go and start Bill, have time for a little bit of general discussion at the end. So I think this is going to go well. I'm excited. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to Michael and start when he's ready.
Thanks, Emily.
So yeah, go ahead, Michael. If you want, definitely give us your bio if you want.
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So, right, I am a professor of geography and geoscience at Salisbury University. I also am the director of the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative, which is a research unit down here at Salisbury. Actually did my master's and PhD work at the University of South Carolina, focusing on environmental hazards and their intersection with GIS. That's primarily the stuff that I teach now at Salisbury. And we've done a fair amount of work over the last several years looking at flooding impact, primarily both surge, coastal flooding, as well as riverine flooding in Maryland. Done a number of flood mitigation plans for counties. Actually, we just finished up as part of a partnership. We just finished up the updates to the hazard mitigation plans for both Newcastle and Kent County, Delaware. So, anyways, that's background. We were asked to partner with State Highway Administration here in Maryland to look at this concept of sea level change and coastal flooding and what it could mean for assets within Maryland. So we'll jump right in. My co-conspirators here, Art Limbo is a mine across the hall, does a lot of work with different types of GIS modeling. Brett Doblstein works for me in the SRGC, and then Mike Sheffer is our contact at State Highway. Is very instrumental in doing this work. So just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with, and many of the communities that you know are also dealing with this too. This is southern Dorchester County in Maryland. The concept of rising water over time is not it's not a hypothetical for them. It's very real, as it will be for many as time marches on here. This is just what a spring high tide looks like in that area of the world. And they are not they're fairly used to roads being covered with water, sometimes twice a day. So what we're going to try and figure out is where can we see those sorts of impacts as we move forward in time. Here's your factoid of the day that you might not have known. Maryland has 3,190 miles of coast. That's actually the longest coastline relative to its size. It's 26%. So you cannot say you did not learn something today. That's exciting. So the Mid-Atlantic, of course, and I'm sure you all have been talking about this, we're going to have some of the worst impacts of sea level change. And it's because of that combination of both rise as well as subsidence. There was just a good article published about that a couple weeks ago from the USGS about the rates of subsidence and some studies that are being done there. As well as our relative position to the North Atlantic Gyre and the Atlantic Ocean because of that positioning, we're going to see a bit more sea level change as well. So State Highway knows that they have an issue. They have many resources that are in the coastal zone that need to be protected. They go through a variety of processes to upgrade those over time, and when they do, they want to be making good decisions on what sorts of mitigation measures they want to be taking. And they can't do it all, so we're going to have to go through some sort of prioritization. So this is just the overall process of our, essentially we are very lucky here in Maryland. Well, lucky and the result of a lot of hard work of a lot of people for time, and that is we have a significant amount of very high resolution LiDAR data that allows us to model elevations of sea level change, and so that's tremendous. We used the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimates for sea level change for both mean sea level and for mean high water. So that's your spring tide essentially in both 2050 and 2100. One of the things I'm going to show you today is the method that we used to try to improve the typical bathtub model, which we used, but try to improve upon through our tidal flow network. I'll show you what that is. I think that's one of the big things that came out of this work. We then looked at, in addition to sea level change, we're interested in the 10-year, the 25-year. Now we're trying to be consistent with FEMA and use our percentages for our chance floods. So the 10% chance, 4% chance, 2%, 1%, and 0.2% chance flood. So that's everything from a 10-year flood to a 500-year flood in those different scenarios of sea level change. We then pulled together what we call a hazard vulnerability index. Basically, it's a shorthanded way of trying to figure out how to prioritize different road segments so that we can rank them, and then State Highway can make some decisions about some they need to study more, some we can probably ignore because they're not going to be vulnerable for some time. And lastly, network trace analysis in order to calculate what the impact of that sea level change would be in different communities, different counties, etc. So to get into it, so the way we go about figuring out the amount of sea level change, this is fairly straightforward and standard, nothing too crazy here. We pull the sea level elevations from NOAA. It's very important to do this step, of course, and anybody who's working with this knows that the terrestrial datum that the LiDAR data is built on, the national vertical datum of 88 versus the tidal datum that all of the sea level measurements are tied to. You have to adjust them to make sure they're on the same reference system, essentially. We use the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers intermediate estimates, both the amount of eustastic rise as well as subsidence. We take those estimates, we push them forward to 2015, because they start around 1992. We push them forward to 2015 to get where we are now, and then we look at how much change in sea level will there be, add that to both your mean sea level and your mean high water, and then we take that information, of course each of it is by a tidal gauge station, and so we assign those stations to a county. And this is, like I said, nothing too crazy there. So here you have Maryland. These are the tide stations that we use. We actually did a bit of a Voronoi polygon to figure out sort of which counties should be assigned to which tidal station. You'll notice we're short them down here in the south end of the bay. Heard good news that they got funding to actually install one in Accomack County, Virginia, so that's actually going to help. And then this one over here, of course, this is Ocean City, so this is the one that's used for Worcester County without questions, the whole different tidal scheme. So these are the amounts, right, of the predicted amount of rise in 2050, 2100, the adjustments, and then pushing those to get, you know, what the adjusted rise will be given you're looking at onto the land datum, NAVD 88. So the way this looks is we first create inundation areas just to take a look at the impact of simply the sea level change will be, not including any of the flooding. And so this is your standard BAF model. As you can see, I'll just run through to give you a feel. This is a community over in southern Maryland near Solomon's Island. So this, for example, is our sea level change, mean sea level 2050. And you can actually see there's no significant inundation of the land surface at this time. There's a bit of elevation, of course, built into the system that takes, because we have rising tides, so it actually takes that into account. But as we push that forward and you add that data in, is the sea level means in 2100, and so you can see areas begin to be inundated. And then you have mean high water. Oh, sorry, let me back up. That's your mean high water in 2050. That's your spring tide in 2050. Then you have your mean sea level in 2100, where you have this large swath that's inundated, and then not much difference really between that and the mean high water in 2100. So obviously by that time you're talking about 5.5 feet of rise or something. So that's where you start to see a lot of the inputs. Now the trouble with that model is, of course, it does rise. Everything's sort of like a bathtub. The problem is you have areas that are not connected to the tidal system that are caught up in those seas. So if you look here I'm a little, see how that little arrow thing works. Yeah. All right. So if you see this area here and actually this area here, both of these are below what we would expect them to be for the amount of sea level change. However, they're not connected to the tidal on the outside. So you have the land, you have your inundation up to a certain point. This is high ground surrounding. This is a local minima. So what we tried to do, and we're fairly successful, I'll turn that off, was create essentially a network data set using a hydrologic data set to find all of the flow lines for each county within the state of Maryland, have that connected to the bay or the river, whatever tidal system that those tributaries flowed into. And then we use flow lines to test, essentially, if each of the areas within our battle actually is connected to the tidal system. And this pretty well. So as you can see, here's sort of before and after. What it ends up doing is it gets rid of these areas that are not actually connected to the tidal system. Now that isn't to say that as sea level rises, you might not get groundwater, and so the groundwater levels will rise and that sort of thing. That certainly is possible, but it definitely, from our perspective, is beyond the complexity of our study at the moment. We're going to leave that to the groundwater guys, who there's a lot going on with that, trying to figure out how much of that is actually true. So we were pretty happy about this from essentially a tide scenario and what we can expect to have it be impacted. Okay, so from that, we then work about creating flood depths and flood depth grids. We're doing that, again, for these recurrence intervals of 10, 25, 50, 100, and 500-year floods. And then we have these 4 sea level change scenarios, 2050 and 2100. So we're running those flood depths, in other words, the expected depth of flood water at each grid cell in the model per county. So it ends up being 20 different depths per county. So it's fairly significant, a lot of stuff there. We actually use HAZIS to do this modeling. I'll talk about that in a second. The way we go about doing this is we're manipulating the current DEMs. In other words, the way we make that work is you take your DEM of 2015, we actually drop it down necessary amount of what you would expect sea level rise, and therefore you create a DEM, you're creating a land surface as if it were 20 or as if it were 2100, and then run the flood on top of that. And we're getting some pretty good results. You can't have one of these things without the sort of gratuitous ArcGIS model that runs the thing. Nobody can actually read this, but it looks very impressive. So moving on. Again, we've had a lot of great luck with HAZUS. I've been running HAZUS back when HAZUS first started many, many moons ago, and have done pretty well with it in terms of creating depth grids in a variety of different different scenarios. For those of you who have not messed with HAZUS before, its flood model essentially contains simplified versions of both hydrology and hydraulic models. And it's important to recognize they are simplified. There are much more complex models that could be run to do these depth grid creation. However, that takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and often needs data that we just don't have. The good news about HAZUS is there's been a fair amount of both pre-event and post-event accuracy testing of how deep it gets with different scenarios. They've done this with Katrina and Sandy, and there's a whole bunch of others to make sure that the models are giving good results. They're not going to be perfect, but then again, we're dealing with estimates sort of all up and down the line of this thing, so we feel pretty good about using this as a prioritization system. So here's what that looks like. So here's the DEM. This is Chesapeake Beach, if you know Chesapeake Beach over in Calvert County, Maryland. So this is the DEM of today. You can see the light blue is where we have water today, and then the land surface. This is what that same land surface, we predict that land surface will look like in 2050. And again, a good angle, as you can see, right through here. So this is an area, this happens to be a floodplain of a coastal river. We're anticipating that that is going to be water in 2050, no longer very low swampy land. And then, on top of that, we then run the flood. And so you can see with the flood grid, this is the 100-year flood grid, you can see the range of blue colors. If we were in GIS, you could go in and click on that blue color, and it would tell you how deep the model expects the water to be at that peak 100-year flood. So using that, we then come up with this hazard vulnerability index. And essentially what that is a combination of three main components. One's the depth of the water. So if you're sitting in a road that has 2 feet of water or one that has 3 feet of water, you might have a different opinion about how vulnerable that thing is. If it's an evacuation route or not, essentially gives the thing priority. We've got a lot of low swampy land around the coastal parts of Maryland. Getting those people out in the case of a disaster is extremely important. So whether it's an evacuation route is important. And then finally, and the main driver of it beyond depth is the functional class. So if you go through and you are flooding an interstate versus you're flooding a local neighborhood road, that's going to give you obviously a different level of prioritization, right? And so here's the little formula. What are all the fancy numbers with? Well, to be honest, this is us manipulating these values to get it to come out to be reasonable. And one of the things we'll talk about, sort of a caveat here at the end, is we're now taking this HVI around to the different shops and trying to see if they feel that our values are reasonable. So here's just a quick look at what the HVI looks like. Part of its problem is that the roads are so small. When you try to look at this from a statewide view, it's very hard to see. But so this is Crisfield. Crisfield was impacted by Hurricane Sandy in a very significant way. So it garners a lot of attention here in Maryland. We're talking about flooding. What you're looking at there in the blue is mean sea level of today, so water levels as they are today, plus a 10-year flood event. So this is the level of flooding you would expect, coastal flooding, that you would expect about once every 10 years on average. And then the color coding of the streets is the HVI. So the green is not impacted at all. The yellow is somewhat impacted, and then the orange is a medium level of impact. And so you can see downtown, right, gets some streets that are, immediately impacted. We're actually very concerned about the area For example, right here, this is the major route in and out of town, and so when we see an area like that that's flooded, this is the kind of stuff the State Highway would like to know so that they could then prioritize any upgrades to that road, which might have been planned anyway, and trying to plan ahead for what the impact will be. So that's today. So if we look forward in time, this is what mean sea level in 2050 looks like with that same event. And obviously, you know, not good news for our good friends in Crisfield. So this is about a little bit over a 2-foot rise in sea level, and then the 10-year flood on top of that. And many of those roads that were in, you know, the greens or the orange, the yellows have gone now to oranges and reds. And so this is a fairly significant scenario and worrisome. Although we knew this is one of those things. Good science, proving the obvious, that, you know, Crisfield has a flooding problem, so there's nothing new about that. And then we have the map that, you know, nobody wants to see. So this is the 2100, and there are only really a few places left in Crisfield in 2100 if sea level rise scenarios continue to play out. So we're kind of hoping that our good friends in the climate science are kind of wrong about that, even though there's no indication that that's true. But that's what it looks like, and it's fairly dire for folks in our low-lying areas. So lastly, again, trying to come up with comparisons from a prioritization perspective is, well, how can you tell sort of which county, let's say, has more of an impact for this than others so that you can reallocate resources or try to figure out where to spend your time focused on. And so we did some network trace analyses. And essentially what this does is we took random locations throughout the county that were seeded based on population. So those areas that had a lot of population, they got more starting locations for an evacuation is the idea. And then we put egress points at the edges of the counties, and then a couple places we did to major shelter locations within the county, and did optimal paths between those population locations and the egress points. So we did the optimal path today with no problems, and then we did the optimal path using the HVI results and looked at the changes to those paths. And normally there's two possible outcomes. One is that they lengthen, so the path is much longer, you can still get there, and then the amount that's unreachable. So let me show you kind of what that looks like. So and we got a ton of these graphs. We don't have time for them all today, so I'm running out of time. But just to give you a feel for this, for example, this is comparing both Anne Arundel County, which is an urban county here in Maryland, and Somerset County, which is a rural county in Maryland. And we can see here MSL non-event. So this is mean sea level, nothing going on, right? Just mean sea level today. We can see that 100% of the locations in these counties are reached, which makes sense because there is no significant change. That's true even in 2050. In 2050, for both Somerset and Anne Arundel County, all of the locations continue to be reached. And that's because there's a certain amount of resiliency built into these networks because of tidal changes now. However, in 2100, we can see just simply mean sea level changing means that only about 85% of the locations in Anne Arundel County were reachable. And of course, Somerset in 2100, you're down to below 50%. And most of that is all of the areas along the coast suddenly can't get back to the main roads that get out of the county. And then you can see how that changes if you add a 10-year flood event, a 25-year flood event, et cetera, right? One more, just to give you a feel for what this looks like. So here is a location. This is in Somerset County. This is Princess Anne, and it's one of those population spots. And here's an egress spot in Pocomoke City to the south. The normal route, as you can see, would run down Route 13, and this is almost essentially the entirety of Route 13 to Pocomoke City. If you were to lose this bridge over the Minokan River, right, because we can see the red lines there, those are HVI values of high vulnerability. If those HVI values are suddenly in play, then the path to get to Pocomoke City involves going all the way up to the north, all the way around this thing, all the way back down, and then catching the route down Route 13 it increases the distance by about 20 kilometers. And so we can take that and add that up too to get some feel for, who is, impacted the most. And then we're having a conversation about doing some sort of economic impact to that. So anyway, just to finish then. So again, there's a lot of important caveats to these things. First of all, as we all know, sea level change estimates are a moving target, which is a real concern for us. The one good thing, though, about this range of scenarios that we're trying to do is that it's covering all sorts of different potential components and levels of sea level change. So that's going to give State Highway a lot of data from which to operate if the sea level estimates begin to change drastically. We've got some places in Maryland that the LiDAR data is a bit older, so it's not nearly as accurate or precise. And believe me, the best data you can get for this is what you need in order to do it well. The sea level change is certainly not going to be as consistent as we are pretending it to be. We're giving one number to a county based on one tidal station that may or may not, be directly in the same line, the same pattern as they are. So that's probably going to be wrong. We do not include waves. The wave modeling in HAZIS is not very good. We omitted that. These are still water elevations only. It's an appropriate thing to do because the wave scenarios, of course, are dependent on the wind direction and all sorts of other stuff. And we want to try to create some sort of baseline from which to work. But that doesn't mean we should ignore them altogether. We really need to get back in there and figure out another way. The coastline change. So we're still assuming that the coastline is going to look the same, even though the water has now risen. The coastline will be underwater. When the water rises, all of the geomorphology of what's eroding and what's accreting is going to change as well, so we know that's not going to be the same. Flood recurrence intervals are likely to change. So anyway, there's lots of reasons why trying to figure out what's going to happen 35 or 85 years in the future is difficult stuff, but we think still worth doing. So I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, so I'm not sure, can you hear me, Michael?
I can.
Okay, awesome. So I don't think we have questions online yet, but we do have a handful of folks online. Do you guys have questions? Speak loud enough. Okay, I'm getting nods here from, I don't know, I'm personally pretty interested in the Chrisfield thing. So have you modeled other similar towns to Chrisfield? I mean, I would imagine Chrisfield are the more dramatic.
Yeah, no, this is just an example. So we have the exact same data. We are working on creating it for all the counties. We're working our way through different SHA districts, which is the way they organize themselves. So you have the same level of mapping. We will end up having the same level of mapping for everywhere in the Chesapeake, but right now, you could do this for Annapolis. You could do this for Salisbury, Cambridge, we're, Solomon's Island. We're primarily working in southern Maryland and lower eastern shore at the moment, but the rest of it will be done next year.
Wow. Yeah. Are you guys familiar with those areas? I couldn't tell them.
I would say the other thing that feels good about Chrisfield is that when we looked at our model versus the high water marks that were recorded during Sandy, they were very similar. So we're and of course it depends on, and people are arguing about what recurrence interval was the Sandy flood and that sort of thing, but we know that we are, if we're not, we're likely not perfect, but we're not way off base either. So
we do have another question. We have to be kind of more positive.
Yeah, so have you used any of the stormwater infrastructure GIS data to account for that factor at all, or do you think that plays?
Right, we have not. So there's that, right? So that's going to be an issue. We know that in a lot of our towns, of course, the stormwater infrastructure is actually conveying surge flooding up into places where you would not normally see it. And so we have not done that. Now, one of the things that State Highway is really interested in looking at is a lot of the infrastructure that they're concerned about is involved with stormwater conveyance, and so they're trying to get a handle on, all right, well, for culverts and various stormwater ponds, if they're likely to be inundated during as seas rise, how could they be changing the way they are currently configured? And in fact, most of it involves, if they've already got a project that's planned to go in, let's say they are going to redo a bridge abutment because it's in disrepair. Well, now how should they be doing it to take into account the potentials for sea level change? But I think the stormwater thing is a great point.
Okay, so we still don't have any questions, and we are it's time for switching speakers. So if you can hang out with us, Michael, that'd be awesome. And
yeah. Yep, I will be here, absolutely.
I'm hoping it's how to pronounce his name, so be sure to tell us how to pronounce his name. And I'm going to go ahead and switch the slides, and then I think we're going to make it so that what we're projecting is what Bill can control. And I will then follow Bill's thing for the people on the webinar.
I'll just mention while you're switching, I'm readily findable on the internet. If anybody had any questions, want to follow up later, feel free to find me, Michael Scott at Salisbury University, and throw me an email.
Great. And the slides are available on our website. Thank you, Bill. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for inviting me here today to talk about a local example of how we're looking at pride. Emily got my name very close. My name is Bill Switek. I'm a senior planner with the Bloomington Area Planning Council, the NPO for this area, which includes Newcastle County. I switch over to Newcastle County here in Delaware, which is right there on the right-hand side, and Cecil County, which is a county in Maryland. You can see that both counties are situated right along water bodies, so they both have impacts to sea level rise that we have to think about. Newcastle County is a more urban county, mainly suburban county. Once you get outside of Bloomington here, population about 500,000 people. Cecil County, much more rural, small towns, and so forth, about 100,000 there. Just a background about LMATCO and what an NPO does. As an NPO, we really put together a long-range transportation plan. So our current plan goes out to the year 2040. And can you talk a little closer to the mic? Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. So as all right. And then within that long-range plan, we coming up with that. Afterwards, we have some regional plans and some local plans to try to implement the vision of what the long-term plan is. And sea level rise is very much one of those regional plans that we came up with. Today's presentation, I'm just going to go over sort of the approach that we took to doing the sea level rise vulnerability analyses, taking a look at some of the regional impacts that we have, as well as some of the local impacts. Then really talking a little bit about policy. So we did this study 2 years ago. How have we incorporated it into the policy at LMATCO? And then how are we using it in our different planning processes, both sort of locally within a couple of examples and then regionally as well. So the goals of the analyses was really to first, inform and influence the adaptation planning process. We have to adapt to sea level rise. First, you got to sort of know which areas may be inundated at different scenario levels. We do that by identifying at-risk planned infrastructure, both the existing infrastructure, but also importantly the infrastructure that we have planned that's going to be coming online in the next few decades. And then, addressing climate change is the key reason for doing this. At the time, we thought climate change was going to be part of the federal transportation bill. Really didn't make it into it, but we still feel good about being a region that's beginning to address climate change. And then continuing the work that Delaware has begun, the state of Delaware, and also the work that the state of Maryland has begun to address this as well. You saw some of the work that SHA put together. They were one of many partners that were on our steering committee. In addition to those
that department, we had members of the public, advocates that were interested in climate change, sea level rise, state environmental agencies, county planning department, and also a group from the University of Delaware for doing some research on sea level rise. So here's the inundation layers that we used, and both of these were two sets. The one for Newcastle County, and this one was developed by DENRAC, looks at 3 different scenarios. Basically a 0.5 meter rise, a 1 meter rise, and then a 1.5 meter rise. These have a whole bunch of caveats. You know, the bathtub model, so with so on, but it gives us an idea of what areas might be impacted. Cecil County, we used the data that SHA was using at the time, which is less accurate than the presentation we saw beforehand. This one looks at a 2-foot rise, a 5-foot rise, and then a 10-foot surge scenario. Overall, between the two counties, you can see some big differences. About 10% of the land in Newcastle County would be impacted by sea level rise, only about 1% in Cecil County. And that's just due to the differences between, you know, the Delaware River and then the Chesapeake Bay, so the two pieces of waterway that are a little bit different in terms of the impact. In terms of our methodology, we took a look at those scenario levels and then identified which neighborhoods were impacted. We used the census block groups to kind of be a surrogate for neighborhoods. Anyone who's worked with the census, they're a little bit smaller than the tract level, so about the size of a neighborhood or two grouped together. And then we grouped those neighborhoods into clusters, so grouping the block groups that were impacted together, and those were kind of our zones of inundation. And then just taking a look at the regional impacts, and then specifically the local impacts within those clusters. So just some regional impacts that we can note. These are the different roadways that are impacted by sea level rise. And you can see just much more road surface impacted in Newcastle County versus Cecil, all the way from 9 miles of road at the 0.5 meter rise in Newcastle down to about 28 miles of road impacted at 1.5 meter rise. Cecil County, you see just about a half mile impacted at a 5-foot rise, all the way up to about 3.5 miles impacted during a surge of 10 feet. Specific roads, really the main one that's impacted in Newcastle County is State Route 9, which is kind of a road that travels along the river. It links Wilmington up in the north with Dover, the state capital. And just wide swaths of that road are impacted at the cuts near the river here at Newcastle, Delaware City, so forth. And different parts of the road are impacted at different ride levels, but it's definitely our main concern. In terms of Cecil County, not much roadway impacts here. SR7 is probably the worst one, and that's located in Elton, which is a town towards the Delaware border. We also looked at railway impacts, and in terms of rail, we have about 4 miles of rail in Newcastle impacted at the 0.5 meter rise level, all the way up to about 9 miles impacted at the 1.5 meter rise. Specific rail that are impacted, we have both the freight rail, Newcastle County Secondary, serving the Port of Wilmington, that's hit pretty good, as well as the Northeast Corridor, which is where the Amtrak train let the travel along. Different parts of that railway would be impacted as it gets near the Delaware River. In Cecil County, we have the Port Road Branch, which is a freight rail line that goes up the Susquehanna River, and you can see that one is impacted at the 10-foot surge scenario. We took a look at a whole bunch of other measures in the study, and I don't have time to take a look at these in depth today, but looking at impacts to bridges, impacts to tolling facilities, roads that were evacuation routes being pulled out as well, bus routes and bus stops, looking at impacts to the train station. Wilmington train station, for example, would be underwater at a 1 meter rise. Ports, marinas that we have, airports, luckily none of the airports that we have were impacted by sea level rise. Commercial units, residential units. And then the 3 I'll talk about today have to do with social equity, planned projects, and then our critical roadway index. So for social equity, that's a part and parcel of our planning process in Alaska. concentrations of the different minority populations, low-income populations. And long story short, we found that block groups that were home to concentrations of Black and also low-income populations had greater likelihood of being impacted by sea level rise. Looking at plan projects, this is something that's important too for a long-range planning agency, and this is actually an updated one based on our 2040 RTP. Just taking a look at all the different planned projects that we have, and do they fall in areas where they might have some sea level rise impact? And then at what scenario would they impact that? And then this is great information to pass on to the project designers to say, hey, maybe you can consider elevating that road, maybe consider some other mitigation measure to keep that infrastructure. So just as an example, number 3 here is the Christina River Bridge. There's a plan for a new bridge just right in this area. Just kind of as you walk outside the conference center, right behind some of the shops that are located, there's a plan to put a bridge across the Christina and hook it up with Route 13. And, you know, in considering the sea level rise impact, they actually raised the approaches to that bridge by 2 feet. So that's kind of one example of how this work has led to some change on the ground in terms of engineering. We also developed a critical roadway index, really just to try to get the conversation started about, you know, what infrastructure is more important to preserve and what infrastructure maybe we don't think about as quickly. And this was based on a whole bunch of different factors, including the area's demographics, its inundation scenario, you know, with places impacted at a lower scenario, more important than those at a higher scenario, and then also the traffic characteristics, how much traffic is moved on that segment of highway, and then basically being able to put together a thematic here showing which roads were a little bit more important perhaps than some of the others, and basically places that were in urban areas, so roads that were impacted by sea level rise came out much higher than a segment of road, for example, that was in a rural area. I'll just note that I think it's really important with this adaptation process to consider things beyond transportation. Because when you think about it, the value of a road is really only based on what that road serves. So if a community, if a roadway is impacted by sea level rise, it's likely that the industry that it's connected to, or the housing that it's connected to, or the commercial that it's connected to, will also be impacted by sea level rise. And if those uses aren't preserved, then what's the use of preserving the roadway itself? So when we make those decisions, it's really important to have everybody in this room to decide, you know, where we want to invest our dollars in terms of protection. Local impact, this is just taking a look at our different profiles of the different neighborhoods. Basically, we came up with 20 different clusters that were impacted just based on where those scenarios, sea level rise scenarios touched. And just to give you a profile of one of them, this is the most impacted one, which was cluster 6, South Wilmington. We're actually over here, all the way on the top left-hand corner. You can see the ball stadium right here. We're actually underwater at a 1-meter rise. But right across the Christina River from us is cluster 6, and that's South Wilmington Peninsula. And this is home to a lot of very important infrastructure, including the Port of Wilmington, which is right there. So totally knocked out by sea level rise. And for each of these clusters, we basically just put together a profile looking at, you know, with the population that's there, what's the population, the employment that's there, what is projected to be in the future, you know, different characteristics like environmental adjustments. Again, just to really start the conversation of maybe this is the way that we need to take a look at adapting at this kind of cluster level to consider transportation impacts, but also some of the others. Just to illustrate some of the transportation impacts, we, you know, looked at, zoomed in and kind of looked at what segments of road would be impacted at different levels. Same with rail, the bridges that would be impacted, and then also the number of residential units and commercial units that would be, and perhaps that plays into whether you retreat from an area or whether you go ahead and try to protect it at some level. In terms of how we incorporated this into our policy and the planning process, had a number of different recommendations that came out of this study. One of them was to incorporate climate change into our long-range plan. What's it in our long-range plan? To look at it. So that was an important one. To measure the effectiveness of climate change was a really important one to show up that was an internet will not go. Monitoring the planned projects that we have, which is something we're doing. Enhancing our public outreach in terms of climate change, getting folks to talk a little bit more about it, and then just supporting some ongoing climate change planning efforts. So one of the key things was getting that into our long-range plan. And that sounds like an easy, no-brainer type of thing, but believe me, it was a struggle to get sustainability and climate change wording into our long-range policy. And it's really important because that means that if I go away or I'm hit by a bus if I leave here, this will continue. We're going to be forced to keep looking at this. Back in 2011, I tried to get it into our long-range plan at that time, and the director of planning at DelDOT usually fell out of his chair and said, basically over my dead body, we're not putting this in here. But in 2015, we were able to get this in, and basically we have an objective now to plan for energy security, climate change, looking at things like VMT reduction, supporting cleaner vehicle infrastructure, and then critically understanding and adapting to sea level rise by doing vulnerability assessments and so forth. This is just a pamphlet that we put together with our public outreach. We have a very extensive public outreach campaign, dozens of different festivals each year. So this is part and parcel of our outreach now to hand these out and talk to folks about what the impacts to transportation could be from climate change. Also put together a website for the more technically savvy folks. Resilience and adaptation planning, we've been in support of a lot of the state efforts that have been underway, specifically very locally in the city of Wilmington here. I'll be talking briefly about that. Also, Delaware Coastal Programs have done a great job with different assessments, both a vulnerability assessment, now having an adaptation plan for the state, and also different DelDOT initiatives to look at climate change. Just to give you some background on the Wilmington very local effort, again, this is our conference site here. You can see kind of the field. This giant piece of structure here is a propane tank. And again, across the Christina is South Wilmington, which, as you saw, was a really impacted area by sea level rise. South Wilmington has kind of a dual identity. It's part of it is part of this kind of redeveloped riverfront area. And then you often have like a lot of old industrial sites here, brownfields and so forth, and then kind of a working class neighborhood that's really part of embedded in the community, which is Southbridge, right here, all this housing here. Port of Wilmington's further down this way. Basically, Southbridge is an area that's really hard hit right now by current flooding, big, huge concern by residents, and also, by sea level rise. UT did some really cool sociology research in that community recently to talk about sea level rise. And basically what they found was about 75% of people who felt sea level rise was a big problem, but more than 70% of people really didn't know much about sea level rise. So it's kind of a huge disconnect that exists, and that 70% was greater than the state average. So a big disconnect in that community is being hit hard by it, but really doesn't understand it very well. So that has a lot of policy implications to it. Just to give you some on-the-ground pictures of what some of the flooding looks like, this is a view from a resident's porch that basically shows some flooding of the roadway. Again, this is the city of Wilmington picture, a different area. And basically, what's really happening is that some cars for residents, for example, having to replace cars every 2 years because the engines are getting flooded out. As you can imagine, like in a low-income community, that's not something that's sustainable economically. So basically what we did was to try to address this. Back in 2013, we had a big community meeting where we brought together some of the some experts that talked about sea level rise, and some of the city staff engineers said, hey, what are you guys actually doing about this? And then brought the residents together to have a conversation. Because the city was actually doing some work. They really just weren't talking to people about what they were doing, and it was creating a lot of stress on the ground. And then the cool thing was, at the end of their talk, we got to hear from the residents and some of their experiences with flooding and experiencing sea level rise. And I think that was really great for the engineers to kind of hear about. after we had that big workshop, we kind of kept up the momentum, and the following year had sort of another workshop where we gave sort of an update on what some of the mitigation measures were. This is really the biggest mitigation measure that Southbridge is doing. They're doing some stuff with, cleaning out the pipes and ditches and so forth, but really the medium-term solution here is this project to restore a wetland area just west of the community. So this housing, sort of at the top of the slide here, is Southbridge and the buildings that are there, and just to the left of that is a current wetland area. It exists as a wetland, but it's an old, sort of deteriorated site. And the city has an idea to just restore that area, and then to also let it act as a stormwater retention area. And then, to pool the stormwater from Southbridge and sort of put it into that retention area, having to put it in there. Right now, there's a combined stormwater and sewage system that operates. It's really not optimal for this community. So what's cool also about this, kind of from a transportation angle, is that not only will this restoration area promise to be a solution part of the flooding in the community, but also it serves as a transportation link from Southbridge to this part of the riverfront area through both a natural trail that will go through here, and then also a couple new roadways that are being designed kind of further south. So it kind of has a dual purpose. And the community and the city are both really, really excited about this project. There's going to be a big meeting next month to kind of try to define what this wetland is going to look like. We've also incorporated sea level rise into some of the specific plans that Velasco has done. This is an example from North Claymont. We were basically doing a plan at this parcel kind of in the middle of Tri-State Mall, kind of an old shopping center, and we were looking to do a transit-oriented development study there. But sort of midway through that, this steel site called Claymont Steel came into play. Basically, sold off and looking to be redeveloped at this time. So now we're doing kind of a much larger master plan of this whole area, which is really right in the northeast corner of Delaware, right up near the Pennsylvania border. And kind of as part of that study, we're putting a lot of space maps together, and one of those is sea level rise. So looking at what the sea level rise impacts would be on this site, and informing kind of the master planning of the site, what uses would be appropriate, what uses wouldn't. We've also added to that some newer data that Delaware Coastal Programs has put together that we did not incorporate into our sea level rise assessment, that basically takes a look at that possible wave action and also, of the floodplain plus the sea level rise to it. So it's kind of a surge scenario that we're looking at. So you can kind of see sort of the floodplain here, but then also if you add that wave action on top of it, what are the impacts? And no surprise, the impacts are much greater than they would be just base level, sea level rise. I'll just mention very briefly, we did another interesting study in the town of Newport. They were looking to put a train station in. It's right on the northeast border, but we currently have a train station. And we also applied our sea level rise areas to that. Basically found that an area that we had planned on putting some parking at was going to be impacted by sea level rise. So that also influenced that local plan as well. That's my presentation. If you have to take any questions.
I'm curious to hear more about what changed from 2011 to 2015 in terms of being accepted.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just sort of the national movement helped, and also I think locally for us to push the sea level rise study out there really helps just soften kind of the resistance that was there. Also, the planning director at Della changed. So kind of a follow-up to that, do you have an idea of what percentage of transportation plans include like some kind of climate change impact? At the MPO level or like nationally? MPO level. Nationally or
mean, more on the MPO level, like, you know, just do you have a rough deal that it's 10% or 30% or,
Across the country.
yeah.
It's broad. I don't know, maybe half.
What is under 50%? Okay, sorry.
That's just a guess. Yeah, I mean, they are, for the Delaware side, where we have the most impact, I mean, they are the, your 2100 scenarios. The 0.5 meter would be kind of a low scenario, and then the midterm would be the 1 meter, and then 1.5 meter is the less likely of all of those. Which one?
Yeah, which one? You mentioned you modified that.
Yeah, when Matthew does planning, we look at all three scenarios. In the example of the Christina River Bridge project, they just used the low scenario, because the 0.5 meters was changed in structure. I mean, that's something that they could always go back and change in 20 years if the projections change and it looks like we're going to have a higher impact. But it varies.
I think Michael's numbers were, you know, that his 2050 was sort of expecting to sea level rise. So that's only a little bit above the 1.5 or the 0.5 meter.
Right.
You know, so I mean, 1 meter is significantly higher than, I guess, Michael was wrong.
Yeah, and again, 1 meter would be for the, it's done at a year 2100, so that would be the mid-level of 2100.
2100, okay. So you're really projecting 150 years out instead of 1.5 years.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't think of it sort of, it's not thought of that way, it's just sort of, you know, 1 meter would be the mid-level, but then you could, with some variability, you could go up to 1.5 or on a positive side, you could go down to 0.5.
So we do have a comment from online that we are receiving more directives to include sea level rise information through the NEPA process on federally funded projects. It's not explicit at this point, but I have a feeling there will be more emphasis placed on it, especially in coastal areas that have high vulnerability like Hampton Road. And this is the guy at VDOT Hampton Road. And I got a yep from Michael Scott on that.
All right, well, feel free to contact me anytime. You see my contact information up there on the screen. We have to talk. Safe travels, everyone.
Yeah,